Thank you for joining us. You're our first presenter for the festival. I'm just going to present myself. I'm Alex. I'm the art production director for the festival. And we're very excited to begin the festival. Finally, it's our first year to be online because of COVID-19, but it opens a lot of doors and opportunities. So we're very happy to welcome Dr. Kahente Horn-Miller to do the kind of introductions talk for the festival, our first live for this edition 2020. So I'll let you present yourself and you can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Nyawa, Alex. I just wanted to say thank you to the Poundmaker and the organizers for inviting me to speak. Kahente Yuchats, Oxcarde Wakeni I Keha'ka, Niwanjoto, Wat Kunoradun Danazoeko. So I'm Kahente Horn-Miller. I'm Keha'ka, also known as Mohawk. My mother is from Kahnawà, my father is from Six Nations, and I'm a mother to 4 and a grandmother to 1. I am also an associate professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. And so this work and this thinking that I'm presenting to you today stems from the last, I would say, 13 years or 14 years of my life in terms of my research area. And it all began with 8 women in my community of Kahnawà. So it is said long ago that there was a world in the sky inhabited by sky people. And one day, a pregnant woman drops through the hole created under the roots of the great tree and begins her fall to the world below. As she falls from darkness to light, the animals of the world below talk amongst themselves, trying to figure out how to help her. A flock of birds rescue her and carry her gently and set her down on the back of the great turtle. The water animals have made preparations for her, bringing mud from the bottom of the ocean. They place it on the turtle's back until the earth begins to spread out in all directions. Now this is the start of life on earth, and Turtle's shell becomes Sky Woman's home, and the plants that she brought, the tobacco and the strawberries, are her medicines. The story goes on to contain many more elements, including her twin grandsons, the creation of the natural world, and the human race. The story itself is about human frailty, being in relationship, and how to endure suffering, and about finding balance. Through it, as Keha'ka people, we learn about the importance of family, of our history, and of belonging. And we are reminded that we come from somewhere, and that sky world is very similar to the earth world we know, so that we may also respect it and nurture it. So this is our story. So what I'm talking about is our creation story. And from that initial little bit, I've created a performance that I've been doing for over 6 years. I call it We Are in Her and She Is in Us. So this whole piece is about the transformation of a story that we share with our children in books and in murals on walls into a piece or into embodied knowledge where we bring it home again. And so I communicate this story in this performance piece using my body, my eyes, my voice. And so ultimately what this is as I said, is a bringing home of this story. It's about a decolonization of our story so that it becomes alive and once again in the minds of our people. So I see this as my role. It's just only a small part of my role as a Keha'ka woman, as a mother and as a grandmother, to communicate our culture to our children in a way that prepares and strengthens them for what is to come. We know we are in difficult times. We're facing an immense worldwide crisis, not only with our health, but also with COVID-19, but also with the earth. The earth is heading into a crisis as well. So this is a poignant time to reconsider what our traditional stories mean, how we can reclaim them and bring them home and make them relevant, not only for our children, but also for you and your children. So, like others in my community, I had grown up with this story and I'd read it to my own children, and I'd seen it painted on murals and walls at the school and the youth center. But back then, I kind of took the story for granted. I realized I didn't fully understand her or her story until I encountered it again during my doctoral work, where I interviewed 8 women. And in those interviews, they were extensive over a 6-month period. What they would do is, in these discussions that I would have with them, they would reference her, Sky Woman, as a living personality standing in the room with us, and being with them in their daily lives. And so I thought, well, I better revisit the story because there's something there. They're telling me something about her relevance. There's something that I need to learn myself about that story that will help me understand what it is that they are talking about in their own lives and their own experiences of being and living in the community, but also of their keha'ka identity. And so I first revisited the story in writing. And as I was writing the story, as I was thinking through the story, I searched out other versions of it. So we have it in children's books, so very short pieces of the story that are written down into visual books that we share with our children. But it also exists in historical literature, and others have taken the time to rewrite the story and bring out the key elements of the story in book form. But as I was reading these books and these other versions of the story, I thought, there's something still missing. I'm still not making that connection, and I tried to figure out why. So as a way to help me figure out why, I sat down and I started to rewrite the story in the first person as a way to reconnect with her, with Sky Woman. And so every day I would sit down and I would write out, keeping faithful to the key elements of the story, and I'd try to place myself in her shoes, in her body, and try to see the world and what she is experiencing from her eyes. And as I did so, I began to transcend the boundaries, and I moved from being this doctoral researcher to storyteller, to woman, to mother, and eventually it brought me to being performer. And what I ended up doing was using this rewritten story right from the very beginning to when she passes on and goes back to the sky world in my doctoral work as the basis for my theory and method. And then about a few years later, I was asked to perform it, or part of it, at this conference. And that's when I began to think through, what exactly have I done with the story? Because this is very different. It's brought me on a particular journey because I embody Sky Woman, not only as being I am descendant of her, but also as political agency, as a way to bring her back to life, although she's never been gone, as we realize through the stories of these women that I interviewed for my doctoral work. But what I began to see was that her life and story have been overshadowed by colonization. And because of the way that it was viewed, the way that our women were viewed, and are continue to be viewed, much of its female aspect was lost through the male colonial gaze. And so those who viewed and rewrote her story saw her in a very limited way. And so when we look at her life through this female lens, her connection to this idea of the life-giving power is better understood. So in this performance, I dress in traditional regalia with a beaded skirt, leggings, moccasins, a crown, cuffs, and I tell only a small portion of the story in this particular narrative, and it takes about half an hour, when in fact the narrative is much longer and takes much longer to tell. And I tell the section from when she falls to when she lands on the turtle's back and goes into childbirth and births her daughter. So that's the small section that I tell. And so as I speak, I move around the space in a counterclockwise fashion, and I use traditional song and dance, hand gestures, and eye contact as well to help bring her story to life. And so during this performance, I'm her, she is me, we are here together. And so that's what I mean by we are in her and she is in us, because in rewriting the story, I incorporated the lives of those 8 women, what they had shared with me about their lives. And I brought back to life some of the female aspects of Sky Woman's life, using the lives of these 8 women and myself as well. So throughout this has been a very personal journey of self-discovery. It's about reclaiming a strong feminine identity and finding my voice. And it showed me that my ontology then is through the lens of motherhood, womanhood. So the reason, as I look back on this, I'm hoping that this version that I've created, which is the only one of its kind in terms of it being from the first person's perspective, I'm hoping that it makes it more accessible for my children and for your children as we head into these difficult times. And I hope that what it does is it deepens a connection to, well, not only to who my children are as keha'ka women and girls, but also to your connection to the natural world, which has been lost to a large degree. So what I ended up, if I move further on and I began to think about, as I began to perform the story, I began to think about the emotional responses I was getting from the audience and from both male and female. They would have a very deep, visceral response to the story. Some would come up to me crying. Some would say, you've reminded me of when, as old women will come up to me and say, you've reminded me of when I gave birth to my children, and thank you. That really means a lot to me because I forgot. The men, some men came up to me and said, you know, I have reconnected with understanding the power of that birth moment with my wife or my own child, and it really means a lot to me. So there was a lot of different responses in terms of what it did for people. So I had to really think about that and what I was doing and what did it mean to me as a mother, as an academic, as a writer. So I began to keep notes on each performance, and I spent time reflecting on it with my friends and my family who were there with me. So at first I saw it as an act of decolonizing the story, as a way to reinvigorate our own storytelling traditions. And so I began to see that as a way of thinking through and conceptualizing this idea of cultural fluency. And I'll explain what cultural fluency is, but this involves communicating our culture in different ways that make it accessible to a new audience of our children, and also non-Indigenous individuals who want to know more about us and connect with us. And so I think in retrospect, there is a decolonization of our story, and the act of storytelling in this kind of preparation and performance, it is also a rematriation of our story. And I'll explain further what that means. So if we think back to the point of early contact and how Indigenous people are viewed within those contact narratives, you know, my people are one of my people, also known as the Iroquois. We are part of a larger confederacy, are probably one of the most widely studied in the world. And so there's lots of written resources about us from the Jesuits, colonial officials, anthropologists. And so I had to think very clearly about what is their goal. Their goal was to colonize us. So I was taking the story out of the hands and rewriting the story and making it from and placing it and looking at her life through our lens as women. I was taking it out of the hands of those men who'd written it down and opening it up to see, okay, what else can this story tell us? What does it tell us? What do we know from our traditions that have survived as Kanien'kehá:ka women and what are some of the other things that we can see in the gaps between the words, right? So this is how you might serve in decolonizing a story and bringing it apart. And I have to say that writing the story from her perspective was really key to understanding where those gaps are and why, and understanding, you know, where I needed to fill those in, and also what kind of what were the things that were left out and perhaps why. I mean, there's tons of theory out there about Indigenous women, about why our voices are left out of the historical narrative. Many of these people that wrote our stories down or wrote about us were men, and they weren't invited into the women's realm. So I had to think logically of what kind of access these male scholars and colonial officials would have to this woman's realm, and it was probably very little. And so this is why, you know, the story seems to me at first glance so male-centric, so patrilineal. So as I reflected more on this, I encountered the term rematriation. And as I began to put the femaleness back into the story through putting in Haudenosaunee feminine traditions like the burial of the placenta in the family garden, which is something that my family does, and other families in my community and other communities, where when a baby is born, we will bury that baby's placenta under a tree in our gardens as a way to remind them of where they come from. As well, that birth moment of the primal scream that we share, or we do when we're giving that last final push. It's what connects us to our ancestors in the sky world. And so as I began to bring these kinds of traditions back into the story, it gained vigor and began to come off the page and back into life. And this is why I call this presentation Jinijiwa'a. This means to make it alive in the minds of the people. This is a Kanien'kehá:ka word that we use to describe telling our history. It's that Jinijiwa'a, and it means to make it alive in the minds of our people. So rematriation then, let's see, in the fall of 2015, I encountered a Facebook page called Rematriation, or Rematriate. And what it is a site started by Indigenous women that projects a positive visual image of us. One of the artist's founders, Janine Frey Newtley, states that rematriation, she says, is a beautiful alternative to the decolonial project. Whereas decoloniality is an inherent binary, rematriation is something that is generative, is generating. We want to generate and show positive images of depictions of our women and of our alliances and identities. And out of that, we want to try and dismantle those negative stereotypes and representations of us and gain sovereignty over how our images are circulating in the media. And so the term resonated with me, and I felt that that's what I was trying to do with the narrative. And so this narrative then is a culmination of a personal trajectory from academic to performer. And as I said before, it's been a very transformative experience because I create and perform an Indigenous theory. By examining the process of transformation for the performer and the retelling of this story, what I've done is provide an example of cultural fluency and rematriation, where in particular we reinvigorate the cultural metaphors in the language and the cultural principles of our people. So what I'm doing with the story is I'm bringing back and helping people to understand the cultural metaphors, the symbolic aspects of who we are as Kanien'kehá:ka people in a lived way. So reinvigorating cultural fluency then, and I'm creating this fluency then by reinvigorating those cultural aspects and providing you, the viewer, the listener of the story, with a fluency, an understanding in who we are, the importance of our women, and how it might connect us, how she connects us to the natural world and our responsibilities to the natural world. And in understanding that, I'm hoping that out of it, you too will begin to reconnect with the natural world. And so I see this as a process of decolonization. So this connection, now that I look back on it, is what was missing in the written versions of the story. They were always written from the third person. It was always about her over there, what she was doing. You never really understood or got into her head and really saw the world or what she was experiencing from her eyes or from her bodily perspective. And so through this performance, I'm connecting the listener audience to her with these movements of my body, through the sounds I make. And as I said before, late in the story, when she births her daughter, I'm mimicking that primal grunt that we make in the final stage of childbirth. And as I said, it's a way to connect us and communicate with our ancestors through sound. It's our way of saying new life has come. Also in the story, I also remind people of the physicality of nursing one's baby and witnessing the tiny toes flexing in enjoyment as they are nourished by our milk. And these are the things that we experience as women, but often we forget what that feels like. And so obviously the men who wrote down our stories were never able to communicate because they've never experienced that. So if we look at the overall idea of storytelling and oral history, it is through multiple tellings that a story is brought forward. It creates a broader, more comprehensive narrative each time we tell the story. So each time I tell the story, it shifts slightly, and I learn something new from the story itself, from Sky Woman, from the audience and their response. And then I translate that knowledge into the next telling. And so it doesn't diminish the integrity of the original story, the original narrative, because I adhere to the essential elements of the original story all the time. So the story is not perhaps the exact one that my ancestors told, but it faithfully contains and honors its important elements. And the nuances evident in the distinct versions then of a specific history represent as well collectively a broader understanding of the events and the various ways people have internalized them and then also have shared them and communicated them. And so this is the ongoing process of storytelling. I have to say that let me see. In my own interpretation, as I said, is very unique in that it's not just a simple retelling, and it's to my knowledge the only version written in the first person, and it's the only version that actually incorporates the living influences and impressions of Keha'ka women. And so this fusion of lived experience, emotions, and thinking then produces a narrative that gives us insight into her emotional being, the fear and uncertainty she felt as she traveled here to Turtle Island, pregnant and alone. It also addresses the fluidity of life, as I said early on, a woman's ability to procreate as she carries a baby inside her. And so I naturally, of course, I put them in the story, and these experiences inform the idea of Sky Woman's experience. Her waters protecting life until the birth moment, when life on this earth begins, the burial of her baby's placenta in the ground near the home. The women's own experiences then brought me closer to Sky Woman when I was writing the story, and allowing me to feel the deep sadness when her own daughter dies in childbirth, giving birth to her own twin boys. And so I made their lived experiences and associated pain and happiness into an integral part of this longer story as a way to infuse her own experiences with this idea of realness. And I think that's what happens when we do this kind of thing, is that then those people in the audience who are sitting there listening become a part of that story. They begin to feel it because it's real. It's based on real experiences, and they can sense that. And because, for example, the death of a child is something that one never gets over. And women that I talked with expressed the deep lingering sadness of their own experiences. And so as I was writing, I was crying, and I was imagining Sky Woman and her own pain of her daughter's death. And it became real to me. And in this way, their lives gave voice to Sky Woman, and contributing then to that never-ending life cycle of writing, performance, and of life cycle of life, but also to the writing, performance, and the story. So I demonstrate then this aspect of the incorporation of the women's lives into the story, but also her life into theirs, as they shared with me in their interviews. And so as I talk, I show this movement, which mimics the fluid movement of water as it comes in at high tide to crash over the shores and it rolls back out. The story itself speaks to that continuous fluidity of birth, life, death, birth, life, death, that my own people describe. And so the telling then contributes to its continued life and importance for our people as our master narrative, as our creation story. And the wave then rolls out in the form of knowledge I gain from family, community, the women of my original study. And it rolls out again as the Sky Woman story infused with their life stories. And so this fluidity, this kind of movement, this kind of knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, cultural fluidity continues and it happens every time I perform it. The wave comes in through the expectancy of the audience, the gift of their listening ears and their opening eyes, and the movement out again is the telling, the gift of telling itself, and the cultural knowledge that it delivers. And so the emotion and feedback that come to me afterwards from the listener feeds my repeated interpretation and performance of this narrative, and it makes it alive. Jeannie Jiwa. The whole process then becomes this dialogue, this reciprocal and never-ending giving and taking of knowledge. And then we're in relationship and we continue on. So I remember the first time that I performed this narrative at a conference called Performing Turtle Island. And I remember standing in the bathroom and staring in amazement at my transformation. I put on my regalia, and I remember, a calm just came over me as I stood looking at myself, and my hair was long and it fell down my back. And I purposefully decided to wear it loose to remind me of what Sky Woman must have felt as she felt her hair blow around her as she fell from Sky World. And the crown sat on the top of my head and the beaded cuffs on my wrists. And in some way I felt armed, I felt protected, but also I felt othered, because in many of the places that I performed it afterwards, I would be standing in a bathroom in a university or center, and women would come and go out of these places, and they would look at me, but they wouldn't say anything. And it would almost be like I was otherworldly. And I would just, I would continue to, I still felt deeply connected. Even in those spaces, I felt deeply connected to the natural world, to my children. And what I've come to realize is that this process of preparation, the telling, performance, and the question and answer period are actually part of a longer ceremony. So the dressing, the mental preparation, the telling, the engagement with the audience are part of a ceremonial process. And I think that this is part of something that as we decolonize our stories, that this has to be, we must respect that and understand that this is ceremony. We are, in telling these stories, we are reinvigorating the ceremonies of our people. So when in ceremony, my people experience deep connectedness to each other and to the natural world. And as I perform the narrative and then critically engage with the audience responses, I too become a ceremonial being. And so I bring my audience into this ceremony. And what this does then in the telling of this story, it builds these stronger relationships and it bridges the distances. I think Keha'ka midwife Gaji Cook from Haudenosaunee really explains it well when she describes our story, the Sky Woman narrative, or the story, as our umbilical cord to the sky world, where then Sky Woman herself is our connection to that time before. And in the telling of the story, we are activating memory and that connection. And so I see my body and my voice become the vessel through which the viewer and the listener travels with me to the other side, much like a baby being carried inside their mother. I carry them through the words, and this is what I call embodied knowledge. So this story then is about new knowledge discovery. There's many that have heard the story before. As I said, there's many children's books that are out there. It's painted on walls. We bead it into our clothing. But it also, in seeing it, in hearing it again, or hearing it for the first time, it gives a new perspective and a world of insights about the human condition that maybe they haven't encountered before, or it's reminding them. So this deep emotional and empathetic connection then comes as a huge surprise to many. And this idea of Jini Jiwa'a, where it's to make it alive in the minds of the people, is part of that deep connection. And I think that's what surprises people, is that they can see the story, they can see her, and they feel like she's in the room with them. Because oftentimes when you read a book of fiction, any kind of a storybook, oftentimes you don't have that same visceral connection to the characters in the story. It's very rare, in fact. It probably exists, but it's very rare. And I thought, so I think that this idea of Jini Jiwa'a is really accurate in terms of describing that, what the outcome is and what happens when I communicate the story through my body, through the sound of my voice, through the storytelling process. Then the entire project of going from hearing and speaking with the women of my study, going all the way through the rewriting of the story, the performance of the story, trying to figure out what was I doing. Was it decolonization of the story, decolonizing the story? Was it rematriating the story? What this entire project then is a retelling of the Sky Woman narrative. It's about a communication, about reclaiming and sharing our cultural memories. So when we speak of this notion of cultural fluency, what we're speaking about is communicating across cultures and time. It's a powerful method in our stories, because cultural fluency is how we communicate. It's influenced by attitudes and body language and customs and other intangible and often ambiguous aspects of communication that are generally unconscious. There's a scholar, Richard Hill, an elder and scholar, Richard Hill Sr., and he describes cultural fluency as a dialogic process of information sharing, he says, that addresses culture lost through colonization. And he says cultural fluency is founded in the ability to understand the cultural foundations, the intent of our culture as expressed through various stories and traditions that we have. It requires continued discussion on our culture and tradition, moving beyond a primary focus on language proficiency. And so if we move beyond that, and we dialogue about these intangible cultural aspects that we take for granted. We work at rediscovering the thinking of our ancestors and how they determined our way of life and how they teach us through a story like the Sky Woman's story. So he says further, cultural fluency then is always about how we gain this understanding and then put this action into our lives, this into action in our lives. And so as we are very concerned about, of course, about linguistic fluency in our communities, but at the same time, we have to be concerned about how well we understand the culture that this language represents. So this performance then is one such conversation. And it references the interactions and the skills needed to adapt. And so in telling the story, I'm teaching a cultural fluency to the audience, to the listener, so that they may understand who I am and where I come from and what my people are about. So this journey then of a young woman from Sky World to Turtle's Back is a metaphor for those in between spaces that we all experience in our lives. And her journey and her identity is reflected and refracted by the new world that she encounters as she lands here on Turtle Island. And as she stands here on Turtle Being's back, she becomes Sky Woman, and thus a marker for our way of living in the world. And she is untethered, and this symbolized by her fall from the sky world to this new world below. So through the telling of her story, we too become unmoored. And in the visual imagery generated by this narrative, the meeting of the water and sky, we are also reminded of this through the sky dome symbolism found in our beads and tattoos. And so my intonation, my movements, the clothing, it erases this line of separation between the human and the natural world that Western knowledge has demarcated, and then you become part of the ceremony, and you become part of this engagement, you become part of the process of learning and cultural fluency. And so it puts us in relationship with one another. And so for the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous reviewer, it reminds us that we are here together on Turtle Island. You as the viewer listener are put in relationship with the land by acknowledging the story, listening to it, experiencing the world through Sky Woman's eyes. For the viewer from my own people, the ones who've probably heard it before or shared it with their children, the story itself reminds us that we come from somewhere, Sky World and Turtle Island. And that all in all, as the storyteller and the listeners, we are in relationship. And so our relationship is strengthened. And so as I tell the story in symbolic gesture, I extend my hands to the audience and I gift them. I'm silently gifting them and gifting you with the responsibility to share in the stewardship of Turtle Island. And this is all our responsibility. And so it's these kinds of gestures, along with the tone of my voice, that evoke powerful responses. And if we think through, then the idea of rematriation, what we're doing then is reinvigorating a relationship between humans and between humans and the natural world, which is a woman's responsibility. We're strengthening, we're bringing things together that we share this same space. And this is what ceremony and storytelling is all about. And so I'm creating, through the telling of the story, I'm recreating this Indigenous space and bringing you in. So in a more recent conversation, just in conclusion, with Abenaki wampum scholar Marge Bruchac about the work that we do as women scholars, she and I were discussing the importance of women working at the recovery of our traditions and cultural fluency. And with reference to wampum belts, Bruchac described how their manufacture entailed often collaborative projects between men and women, because I'm sure all of you are asking, well, what about the men? Where's the men in all of this? Men made the beads and women crafted the belts, but the symbols within the belts came out of discussion among community members. Yet we have to recognize that through time and colonization, white men's voices overshadowed these objects, much like Sky Woman's story. And the agency of women in the creation and use of the belts was lost. And so you hear a lot about male perspectives on these belts. And so in its written form, the story, the voices of white men still speak on this story. And when it is rewritten from a feminine perspective and performed, these voices are removed. Why are the Native women crucial to the recovery in these objects, we ask ourselves? Rushek says that it's by the very putting of our hands on these objects, we are taking over these stories and objects, and that's what rematriation is all about. So rematriation then, in this instance, describes the activation or the reactivation of cultural fluency through the performance of the story. And we are no longer us and them, but we. And the story goes beyond those anthropologists' understandings, the warriors on any blockade, and the politicians in the boardrooms, and it goes to the heart of what our humanity is supposed to be about: a connection to each other and a connection to the natural world. So thank you very much for listening. Yawakoa.